Lately, it seems every passing second brings news of another climate-driven disaster. But we still have the power to turn back the clock. Harnessing the power of collective human energy, today's university students are working together to chart a new future, demanding and creating the solutions for a sustainable climate. Our focus in science, engineering, activism, and politics offers the potential of a better tomorrow for all of us. Tune in to Campus Climate Corps for news of what is and what is not happening at this year's UN Climate Conference. Prepare for a livable tomorrow with a life and career of action. Join us and become part of the solution.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to welcome you to today's Campus Climate Corps Daily Briefing, our fourth one in a row. Go figure. Today at COP, it's been a pretty interesting day. I've seen a lot of the news out there, a lot of reports from our folks over in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Among them, a lot of criticism of the United States, and especially on the day of voting, which, by the way, if you haven't already voted, please go vote. All this stuff at COP27 matters a whole lot. But it also matters how we approach COP27, who we're sending to COP27, and even COP28 and 29 and so forth. So make sure you're getting out there and voting for the leaders who are going to do their job to represent you the best and actually put forward good commitments at these climate meetings. Speaking of non-good commitments at climate meetings, Secretary John Kerry has been called out quite a bit over the past couple of days about stymieing efforts to discuss loss and damage funds, even as countries like Austria have put forth $50 billion, or countries like Scotland putting in $5 billion for climate for loss and damage for developing nations, and to help them industrialize in an economically beneficial fashion with respect to carbon. So the US is coming out of COP27 so far in the second and third days, looking pretty bad. Meanwhile, some countries like Scotland and Austria are looking really good. So stay tuned. We have a lot of content that we're going to share with you today, starting with, I believe, Esteban. Maybe you can give a little bit of sneak peek about what we're going to see tomorrow with regard to Nicola Sturgeon, speaking of Scotland. If your connection's good enough. Mute.
If my connection allows. So today, as you can see, it's even busier, and therefore the connection is less efficient. We have to share it. So one of the conferences that happened yesterday was in the Scottish Pavilion. Scotland decided to have its own pavilion, besides the fact that there is actually a United Kingdom pavilion. And it held a conference with the Prime Minister of Barbados, the chief of the World Trade Organization, and the Minister of the Environment of Egypt. All of this hosted by the First Minister of Scotland. So what we had there, and this is part of what's going on today. There still the big shots are here. There are on the one hand, Scotland has concrete commitments, and it has been following those commitments. But at the same time, there is a showdown. During that conference, there was some talk of independence again, and as it relates to the climate crisis. And in that sense, the fact that Scotland has its own pavilion, I believe it's not a matter of just, it's not casual, it's not random. At the same time, connecting with loss and damage, today we had the opening statements from various countries, and what we've seen is that it's a repeated pattern. countries from the third world are bringing up loss and damage, and are emphasizing the need for funds for them to actually not bear the whole price of fixing the climate crisis that richer countries cost. And that's something that we've heard on and on in almost every opening statement from the third world. At the same time, from the first world, what we see in the opening statement is an agreement with that, but it depends on which country you ask in terms of how much money have they committed to help the third world adapt, and to help the third world also mitigate climate change. There is one issue, again, intersecting international policies with climate change, that has been repeated during the opening statements. On the one hand, the third world insisted that the Ukraine crisis, the invasion of Ukraine, is not used as an excuse not to address the climate crisis, and not to give financial help to the third world to address such crisis. On the other hand, the European nations, and today we even had the opening statements of Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, essentially saying that bringing up the invasion of Ukraine and connecting it with the current energy crisis in Europe. So again, in a way, two very repeated patterns, different from each other, pretty much divided upon third world and first world lines.
Absolutely. And a couple of follow-up questions or thoughts on that process. One is, I'm curious how much discussion of independence was discussed when Nicola Sturgeon came up there, and did you find it at all that such a political discussion, if so, is going to stymie efforts to discuss, some actual climate concerns?
It wasn't that much of a discussion. I think it was more of a mention, and the fact that there was mentioning, and we'll see it tomorrow. We're currently editing that material, but at the time, it carries symbolic significance. The fact that there is another pavilion carries symbolic significance. Also, the fact that particular conference was carried out with the Prime Minister of Barbados, who just recently acquired independence. I believe it's not something random. So what we're seeing is essentially the intersections of international politics with and the domestic politics tension with climate change. But it wasn't an in-depth discussion. It was more of a mentioning. If you will, there were some fireworks. It wasn't. The mentions did carry a reaction from the public, but at the same time, it wasn't an in-depth discussion, and that didn't take away from the conversation on climate change between the Prime Minister of Barbados, Nicola Sturgeon, and the World Trade Organization head. What we don't know is how much of that is, if that pattern is also reflected indoors in terms of the negotiations we don't get to see.
That makes a lot of sense. Follow-up question to that is, you mentioned the Ukraine conflict. Many news agencies around the world are still reporting on this major, these battlefields happening right now in Ukraine. How much of that is being discussed at COP27? And if so, in what form? Is it being mentioned as a form of detraction, like you were mentioning developing nations are seeing it as a potential excuse not to give them aid and loss and damage funds and remediation funds? Or at the same time, is it simply just a discussion amongst nations right now who are looking at this with interest? What is your thoughts and analysis on how the Ukraine conflict is playing out at COP27?
The third world clearly sees it as a threat, clearly sees the possibility of those discussions stalling the process of financing the third world. On the other hand, what we see on the other side, on the European side, is essentially that they use it. It's been mentioned as evidence of an achievement. In a way, what they are saying is that they will use this energy crisis to confront at the same time climate change and acquire energy independence from Russia. For the moment, and this is not in-depth discussion, these are opening statements. It's all in what the Europeans presented as a win-win. And on the other hand, the third world sees it as a threat to its financial aid and just in terms of help and velocity in action against climate change.
Absolutely. Excellent discussion and excellent response to that question. Thank you so much. Valholly, do you have any thoughts and feelings about how Ukraine is playing out right now at COP27? Have you seen any evidence that any discussions are going on, any major criticisms, complaints? What have you seen?
Honestly, I haven't heard much about it. I've been staying mainly in like the Indigenous pavilions and seeing what the youth is up to. And nobody's really talking about it. I guess everyone has their own issues that they find pressing at the time. But the things that I have heard about it are just very surface level, like asking about the same things we're asking, the presence, what's happening with it, and how it's affecting their involvement in COP27.
Okay, fantastic. That's, and speaking of the youth, what have you seen lately over the past couple of days? I know that the youth had delivered their youth statement to the official chair of COP27. Have you seen the leaders of COP27 saying anything or giving any actions, any statements about the youth so far in your, while you're running around COP27? What do you feel about how the youth are being respected, listened to, adhered to, or lack thereof?
I haven't really seen much. I was actually talking to Delaney the other day about that, and she's been in a lot more of the plenary meetings and like the very high level official meetings. And she said there was one meeting she attended where the youth actually had a representative and a speaker, and they got about 2 minutes in the entire hour-long meeting, and that was it. And from her perspective and from basically everyone else's perspective that I've talked to, it just seems like okay, yes, you're involved. Now, like, be quiet,
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think that position has changed in any of the COPs that I've attended over the past few years either. So it's as to be expected, at the very least, when that's from the perspective of all these big shots. Moving maybe a little bit further into discussion of greenwashing. Greenwashing has been a major topic today, at least in the headlines and the news. And I'm sure that each of you might have heard some discussions about the greenwashing that's been going on at COP27. As of now, close to 80% of all carbon emissions right now are covered by current commitments by nations. The NDCs have promised to cover 80% of all carbon emissions as of right now. If we go through with the NDCs, we're cutting 80%, which is good. But it's also not good because greenwashing is a very dangerous form. It's like playing with fire at this point, because if you're really planning on covering 80% of carbon emissions, but your methodology of reaching that is faulty, or you're just worried about, your election today, and in 4 years down the line, you're going to be out of office anyway. So what do your commitments really matter? Or by some of these major companies out there who are promising to cut all their carbon emissions using faulty reasoning, faulty thinking. Dr. Capece said multiple times the lack of a international carbon accounting standard or even national carbon accounting standard is a major lack of follow through and commitment for discovering how we're really going to be covering our NDCs. So, John, while you're here, maybe you can say a few words on your perspectives of greenwashing. What have the discussions at COP27, or at least what have you seen at COP27 that speaks to how greenwashing is being addressed, if at all?
Well, I plan on visiting the pavilion that is sponsored by the group called ISO, which is the International Organization for Standards. Now, this group, all of these ISO standards help determine how a company or someone doing an energy analysis would evaluate a product or service, and that's critical to avoiding greenwashing. So I'll be curious to see to what extent they are involved and having input to this overall process. There are various levels at which we can evaluate our either collective or individual performance on reducing our carbon footprint. Now, this can be at the high level, where we're simply measuring the amount of fossil fuels that we extract from the ground and in turn utilize in energy production and other ways. So you can't, as long as you properly evaluate that extraction process as well as the leakage process, as in the case of methane leakage, then you can have a large scale accounting of our progress towards reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But as we go down the scale to the individual, the products and services that each of us utilize, the extent of carbon impact associated with those products, that gets much more difficult and tricky to evaluate. And that's where you have to have good methodology in place to do it properly and avoid deception. Now, sometimes it's not deception. Sometimes it's just ignorance. It's mistakes. It's crude accounting methods. So people might, in effect, greenwash without even knowing it. They think they're reporting numbers that are accurate, but they're not. And I have some slides here I'd like to share with you on that topic. And you and I have dealt with this for quite a time. Are you able to see my slides yet?
I do not have them on screen just yet.
Okay, let me get there.
Now we can see them.
All right, good. So the topic of greenwashing is associated with carbon accounting, and that's embedded within this larger topic of ecological economics. Now, ecological economics, why do we need carbon and energy accounting? Well, we have to educate the public on the implications of our actions relative to greenhouse gas emissions. And we have to have a basis for making good choices so that we can reduce our carbon footprint. And without good numbers, we're making blind choices, basically. And often that's driven by advertisement. And that's the basis of a lot of the greenwashing we're talking about. Mm-hmm. So the greenwashing is deception, and it can be, as I mentioned, intentional or unintentional. We also need to have good accounting systems because we need to be able to track the progress we're making in evolving our production technologies, how we're driving down the carbon implications of all of our products and services. Now, the example I use is solar photovoltaics. We all think of solar panels as reducing our greenhouse gas emissions and reducing our individual carbon footprint. While that may be true over the long term, it is not true over the short term. So that might be an example of greenwashing that's unintentional. A strict analysis of all the energy that goes into producing these solar panels and the evolving technology used to produce solar panels results in an ever increasing, not ever, but up to a point, a steadily increasing carbon implication. In other words, by deploying solar panels, we're actually making the carbon emissions problem worse in the short term. But once we reach a critical point in expanding our deployment of solar modules and improving the technology we use to produce those modules, that will turn that curve down towards zero. And then once it goes below zero, we are cumulatively making progress on reducing global greenhouse gas emissions through the use of solar photovoltaics. And a crude approach to evaluating that might predict a year of 2027 when globally solar photovoltaics begin to yield greenhouse gas benefits. Of course, that's a crude approximation. I may be guilty of greenwashing through ignorance, through my rough estimates in this case, but it's important that this sort of analysis be done and be shared widely so that people really understand what's going on. So full accounting is necessary to plan and track our progress and to avoid greenwashing. And new technologies can take decades to yield real benefits. But the exponential growth curve in deploying better technologies can really transform our economy over the long term. Now, the methods used to make these determinations to evaluate the carbon implication of any product or services, there's many methods. And the two that I've worked with the most are called life cycle assessment and energy analysis. And there's sort of two different approaches. The life cycle assessment is more complicated in its results that it produces. And the energy analysis is more succinct in its conclusions. So life cycle assessment involves tracking all of the energy and products and activities associated with the production cycle from, as we say, cradle to grave. And the results generated by this methodology are broken down into categories. You don't just get one number. For example, when we go to the store, we're looking at a single price. We're paying that dollar amount for that product. When you're looking at the environmental impacts, we're paying multiple prices. We're paying a price on the carbon dioxide. We're paying a price on water depletion. We're paying a price on, say, eutrophication, the nitrogen and phosphorus that becomes excessive in our system, and through land use degradation, and so on and so forth. So the life cycle assessment approach to avoiding greenwashing, to quantifying our carbon impacts, is complicated in its results. Now, each of these have different units. The one we're dealing with most directly is the global warming potential, estimated over 100 years of impact, and that's measured in kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents. Now, the energy analysis is a little different in that it takes all of these disparate things and distills them down into single units, energy units, or the memory energy in any object. And it has, instead of this matrix, it has a few sort of indicators, metrics that it utilizes, called energy yield ratio, an environmental loading ratio, renewability percentage, and an energy sustainability index. Now, the way energy does this is its accounting starts way up at the top here with sunlight. A joule of energy from the sun is considered one, and then you calculate the embodied energy. For example, pesticides includes 2 times 10 to the 9th joules, effective joules of energy in a gram of pesticide. So it concentrates, in effect, solar energy extensively. And some of the most energy concentrated objects or products in our society is information. And that's because it's generated by humans through the activities of many humans over an extended period of time. So different things have different embodied energy amounts. Now, how we analyze this is even more complicated. You've got all of these sources and sinks and process transformations that occur in a system. And some objects are external, like the rainfall, the wind, and the sun, and some of the activities are internal to the system. And this is done for just about any product or service. So we in Campus Climate Corps, we take it as, in effect, our mission to promote the use of good carbon accounting and good ecological economics approaches to evaluating the world around us and encouraging our government and people to make decisions based upon this type of information. So to be able to do that, for the government to be able to do that, for people to be able to do that, they must be educated in this way of thinking. And the appropriate place for that initially is at the university. And very few universities, at least in the United States, have programs in this. So we are taking it upon ourselves to emphasize the need for these types of programs and to promote them. And then the universities that are further along, they need to lead in the research to improve these methodologies, not just teaching students about these techniques, but to actually improve the accuracy and the completeness of these techniques. So we in Campus Climate Corps, along with the Graduate Student Honor Society, are working towards this goal. Now, when we here at COP, when we send people to the UN climate conferences, we're very sensitive to our own carbon implications of our travel. When we're here, it's really no different. And in fact, our carbon footprint is probably lower than when we're back home in the way we live. Now, the conference itself, participating in that conference, represents an incredible amount of energy. All the construction that went into developing that facility and getting everyone here and producing all the infrastructure is considerable. So it's important to evaluate that. Now, we can't evaluate the energy associated with COP, but we can evaluate the energy associated with getting us here and sending a few people versus sending a lot of people. So as long as our activities here at COP are benefiting many more people who do not have to travel, in other words, we deliver this information to many more people who are back home, not incurring these airline flights and carbon footprints, then we can justify our presence and our activities. But it's important that we be accurate in assessing these implications and outcomes, because we do not want to be guilty of greenwashing either. So, Rock?
The mission of Campus Climate Corps, I think, is shown brilliantly in those slides. Some of the educational materials that we're able to transcribe, I think, to many of our students, especially those watching and those at the University of Florida, really should showcase, what we were trying to accomplish here. In showcasing the correct way, or at least a possible solution for how to do carbon accounting the right way, we can combat greenwashing in the most effective way possible. Rather than simply by us taking the role of the criticizer, us going to companies or industries and saying, you're bad, you're wrong, it's you who's doing the bad things, you guys are doing the greenwashing, so, bad, bad, bad. Proposing a solution, or at least a pathway towards a good accounting system, therefore showcasing how we can combat this idea of greenwashing with the right methodology, I think is a good way forward. What do you think, John?
Well, it's absolutely essential. You can't make good decisions without good information. We're challenging our government to do the right thing. Well, what is the right thing? Is it better to do this, or is it better to do that? Do you buy this, or do you buy that? They have to have accurate information. And people need to not only have accurate information on specific objects and products and services, but they need to have that mindset. They need to be looking at everything around them from that perspective and sort of doing the math on what's involved. We do that every day relative to economics, relative to money, right? We look at things and are we getting good value for this? Is it worth the money that we're spending? We need to think about it as, is it worth the energy? Is it worth the carbon that we're spending in this process as well? So we need to get people prepared to better think in those terms, not just in dollar terms. Absolutely.
And I think the energy system is an excellent way, a different proposal of how to think of something that it is a non-dollar aspect. It's interestingly a form of currency is the way I look at it, but it also is not a dollar way, or not the dollar viewpoint. Perhaps a more important currency in this respect of fighting climate change. Maybe going more into a little bit more about COP27 directly. Last year, there was a lot of criticism of COP26. The food that was being presented, the way that construction was going on, was a very carbon inefficient manner. There were, Burger King advertisements everywhere, proposing, if you don't like the Impossible Whopper, you can always go back to the regular burger. What do you guys, what have each of you seen on the ground at COP27 with regard to how, are they proposing, are they showcasing that it's being sustainable? What kinds of food are you being served while you're there, et cetera?
So we didn't see, as you say, Burger King or venue in the venue, essentially, but also there is not any talk. There isn't any talk about the particular foods offered and whether they are more or less sustainable. Essentially, you are on your own. You have a selection of sandwiches, pastries, coffee that you can purchase. There is one restaurant operating inside COP27 that, as far as I know, it's an open buffet, but we haven't seen any particular information related to the carbon footprint of the food consumed. There are, as far as we know, all types of meat, for example. So in that sense, no. In particular, there isn't any accounting on any information on that side.
Fair enough. John and Valholly, what are your thoughts on how COP27 is showcasing itself to be carbon friendly or not in either its construction or food?
Well, I guess I think of it a little differently. I think it's important to know the carbon implications of what we're doing here, but that isn't the only measure. I mean, you talked about Ukraine, right? So you've got a country there who's interested in peace, but they're confronted with an invasion. Well, what are they to do? Are they to practice strictly peace and allow themselves to be overwhelmed by the adversary? Or do they have to, for a time, discard their ultimate objective of peace in favor of self-defense, of action? So it's kind of a similar situation here with us dealing with the challenge of addressing climate change within a carbon-based economy. So we have to use those tools, those weapons of transportation and mobility and consumption to fuel our efforts. But our efforts have to be intended as an investment toward a lower carbon economy for everyone. So how you use your, say, deviation from peace or your deviation from carbon neutrality is extremely important. You have to be working toward a proper goal, even if the interim methods aren't always one that you would like to choose if you had a viable alternative at the time.
Absolutely. One of the major criticisms last year of the critiquers was that it's very much a first world, developed world problem to criticize nations who still rely on pork and beef and other forms of meat for their daily proteins, when they simply, as an economy, cannot simply produce vegan alternatives or carbon-friendly alternatives as they are still in the stages of development, which then goes back to the idea of technology exportation and how we should be approaching the idea of loss and damage and mitigation of damage. How are we going to help these developing nations evolve sustainably? Does rely a lot on our exportation for free of a lot of technology that we can produce here as a result of the fact that we are currently industrialized. One question that we have in the chat is from Rhonda is, do you think that oil companies should be represented at COP? I think that's a very valid and important question. I think I already know what your response is going to be, John. But Esteban, do you have any thoughts on what about oil companies? You know, do you see them out in force at COP27? Are they showcasing anything different, if you've seen them at all? And what is your personal thoughts and analyses on the role that oil companies are currently playing in COP27?
So what we've seen clearly are petrostates. I haven't seen pavilions of oil companies thus far. Whether or not they should, definitely there is at least representation of petrostates. And the problem, the question is interesting from the legal viewpoint, in the sense that independently of whether they should or not, would it be possible to ban them from any participation at COP27? I don't think that the framework in which we are at, the UN framework, allows for such prohibition. As we know, there has been extensive lobbying from oil companies, and that has limited considerably our efforts towards decarbonizing. At the moment, the best thing we can do is look at every attempt from oil companies in a critical way. But in a practical way, there may not be any way to eliminate completely their presence at COP27.
Absolutely true. John, what are your thoughts on oil companies and their current presence at COP27? Have you seen them? And if so, or if not, what are your personal thoughts on the role oil companies should or should not be playing at COP?
Well, I think they can be here. The question is, to what extent do we let their presence affect the outcome of decisions? They need to be here to hear what the world is demanding. And I look forward to visiting some of those pavilions and talking with the people and learning about how they plan to transform their economy from dependence upon fossil fuels to one that has a better future for them and for us. So my point in interacting with a petrostate pavilion would be to say, okay, you're making all this money on fossil fuels. How are you investing it? What are you doing with that money? Are you simply consuming more leisure and squandering, that value, or are you using it to educate your people, to develop technology so that you can survive in a world where there is no market for this old product? We developed our civilization first using wood, and then we evolved to I guess even before wood, it was just human energy. And then we began exploiting the energy from wood through combustion, then coal, then oil, then natural gas. And we simply need to move on. We need to move on quickly. So these nations need to move on. So there's actions they need to take to move on as well. But we can't allow their presence to diminish the rate at which we make this transformation. We've got to overcome the financial interest lobby and make sure that the world's nations make good choices.
Absolutely. Valholly, what are your thoughts on oil companies currently and their presence at COP? Have you seen them? Have you not seen them? And if not, what are your thoughts on their presence here?
Yeah, I've seen them here, and it's been conflicting. Like John said, they need to be here, but seeing them heavily involved in processes is interesting, especially when it comes to their history of greenwashing, especially in the United States, and comparing that to Indigenous activists and land protectors, and how oil companies absolutely hate Indigenous people because of their land protection and their fight against especially pipelines recently. It's definitely interesting to see, and I wish more Indigenous people would talk about it the same way that they should be talking about greenwashing, because I haven't seen discussions like that a lot. But I'm excited to see what these pavilions have, especially pavilions like OPEC, see what they have to offer, the presentations they'll be giving, and just how their voice is used and how much it's heard compared to other pavilions and compared to other people.
Absolutely. I don't think there's one among us who disagree with the idea that oil companies and their presence at COP is probably a necessity, but mostly for the oil companies to learn and not to be the teachers at a conference like this. Their role is going to be transformative, not opposing the transformation as it stands. So excellent analysis. Thank you all for that opinion, or for that input. Next, we have some content from our very own Michal Fidler, who's put together a little bit of video for you, maybe to give you some visual representations about what's going on at COP. So let me pull up our video here. And Michal, carry it away. Oh, what's that you say? It's a great video. Oh, thanks, Michal.
Here I am to provide an overview of my today's adventure at COP27. So, like usually, I started my trip to COP on a bus, and noticed that there were these limos going by, having national flags. So here would be a EU flag on one of the limos on the Mercedes. So I knew that it will be a busy day, since the high level segment is taking place today. But before getting in there, I was greeted by this group of activists, and it was the first demonstration I have seen at this COP. It felt kind of like a joke, because it was probably 8 people just saying the same slogans over and over, which was basically eat vegan, make peace, save animals, save the planet. That was the only demonstration I have seen at COP, and it might as well be just the only one that we will see here. Well, let's see how this develops. As soon as I went through this pseudo demonstration, I got to one of the main signs welcoming the participants to COP, and of course that's a photo opportunity. So people were taking selfies and had their photos taken over and over. I could just flip through these images and keep going. Then I saw that the private jets were coming to town. So again, as a sign that the big guns, the big politicians are in town. And if they don't come on the private jets, they come in these nice limos. So here would be somebody from Sweden who just got there in a nice BMW. And people were coming out of these limos. I did not really know who is this guy. I couldn't read it from the badge. Oh, then this limo came, and I thought, hey, it might be Arnold Schwarzenegger, because that's the car he drives. So I waited, and this lady came out. So I was kind of disappointed it was not Arnold Schwarzenegger, but it is what it is. Then I went to the media center, because there where I get oriented, and saw that in the amphitheater, or in the plenary room, one was happening. One of the session, which would be the heads of states and governments delivering their opening national statements. I saw that these news and press people were getting really busy. So for a while I was watching it on a TV, and then decided that I need to get in. Took the photo, this one, which later on proved to be very, very important, and I headed towards the plenary one. Here I met, this is a Prime Minister of Tunisia, so I knew that I'm on my way. But as soon as I got to plenary one, I realized, hey, it will not be so easy to get in, because it was quite crowded, and I did not really have the great accreditation for that. But as Dr. John Capece says, I use these special tricks to get in and get out. So eventually I got in. I was promised to have 5 minutes, so just took this photo and then slowly crawled forward to get a better shots. And eventually I end up there where I really wanted to be. And instead of spending there 5 minutes, at the end I spent there 5 hours. But a little later to that, people like to measure, or men like to measure their masculinity by comparing the sizes of their various organs. The photographers compare themselves by the size of their lenses. Unfortunately, this is not my set of lenses. I had the smallest lenses there, but it is how it is. Eventually, I started to take photos of all the heads of states and presidents and prime ministers and so on. And soon I lost a track who was who. So I can tell this is the prime minister of Bulgaria, here being simultaneously translated. And here would be, I am sorry, I can't even remember who is this guy, but just know I mean, this is head of state of another African state. I just can't remember where he was from. But note the red number in the right corner, because every participant had only 3 or 4 minutes for delivering their speech. Not everybody was following the rule. I think the winner of extending the time was the Prime Minister of Venezuela. Well, this is not him, but he went 13 minutes over his time. This would be the President of Austria. This would be the main stage where the politicians were delivering their speeches. So it would be a close-up on yet another president. I believe this was Rwanda. This would be another Prime Minister. I think this is Cyprus. Another prime minister, I believe this was Somalia, and so on. So we always, as photographers, got a chance to just go get close to the floor, and had a minute or two take our photos. So we went there, took the photos, and ran away. Then we went directly to our computers and tables and worked on getting the photos processed. Finally, there was a break because the program was just getting very late. So we had about 30 minutes break. And the security suddenly wasn't so tight at all. We got a chance to get to the podium, or not me, I didn't really want to go there, but the delegates went there and were taking photos on the stage, right there on the podium, pretending that they are the main speakers. So this gentleman from Somalia asked me to take photos of his photo. Here would be just another example of what I wanted to show. Then the break was over, and the big guns were coming back again. So here would be in the middle, that's Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, discussing stuff with Charles Michel, the guy on the right, President of the European Council. And although during the first part we were not allowed to get any closer, suddenly nobody cared. So I just got to Ursula von der Leyen. I was 2 meters from her and was allowed to take photos like this. Then the president of that session came, and other people showed up on the podium. So the speeches started again. So here would be a close-up of Charles Michel, again President of the European Council, delivering his speech, and just from a different angle, and Ursula von der Leyen delivering her 5-minute speech. Topic-wise, it was really just mitigation, adaptation, finance, and collaboration in all colors and all flavors. Sentences like "crisis is here, we must act, action now, together we can do that," and it was just over and over. Each head of state had a chance to deliver his speech, and well, I have heard it today maybe 40 times. So after Ursula von der Leyen, I was thinking that it was time for me to leave, and because there was just yet another head of state, then I waited for this gentleman. You might not be familiar with him, but it's the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic, so that's where I come from. So I wanted to listen to his speech. It was similar like the other speeches, except that he also mentioned the war in Ukraine and its implications. This would be our Prime Minister on the left-hand side, just discussing with the Minister of Environment how was his speech. And this would be, I think, the last image for today, showing that there is a hope. I voted for the guy on the left, so I had a hope in him, and he gave me hope that there is still a hope to get things done. So rather than spending there another 2 or 3 hours in the plenary listening to the same messages over and over, I went out because I was kind of tired from meeting all these or seeing all the presidents and prime ministers, and yet again I met the Czech prime minister again just walking by. So with this image I'm finishing my short overview of today. Spent most of the day in the plenary and met more heads of states within 5 hours than during the last years together.
Well, I can definitely say from at least my perspective, I think I speak for everyone saying that Michael's presentation is always entertaining, and the photos are always amazing, always really good to watch. Okay, before we close off here, since we're getting towards the end, is there any last and final remarks from our team over in Egypt? Anyone have anything left to say before we close out for tonight?
Well, one of the things I noted in the speech by the UN Secretary General was his emphasis on cooperation between the top 2 economies. He basically said if the US and China can't find some way to get together and really focus their collective capacity on tackling this issue, there's really no hope for achieving a solution.
Absolutely. Which is, again, a really big shame that China doesn't have a pavilion this year.
Actually, they do have a pavilion. We found that there's a 5th pavilion pod. And my presentation the other day listed, 116 pavilions. Mm-hmm. And I was guessing that there might be another 30, and it turns out that there were about that many. There's actually 141 pavilions. So we found a China pavilion. That's good to see, but we haven't found a Mexico pavilion. Colombia and Venezuela have pavilions, and a couple of other Caribbean nations, but I don't see a Mexico.
Mm-hmm. All right. Other final remarks?
It will be a matter of the rich countries of the world today in their opening statements essentially emphasize that again it was their duty to help nations, third world nations, but it will be just a matter of waiting until the end of COP if they live up to that promise, and whether the opening statements of today were lip service or not.
Really good point. All right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for attending our Campus Climate Corps Day 4 briefing. Stay tuned tomorrow for Day 5, where we have some extra fun content that we'll be going over. And as always, if you do have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to reach out to us. We're happy to cover any and all content that you would like us to. We have a Twitter account, Instagram account, Facebook, and YouTube. So feel free to reach out on any of those platforms, or feel free to send us an email. And until tomorrow, we will see you. Take care, everyone. And from our team in Egypt and in the US, we all hope you have a wonderful day.
Lately, it seems every passing second brings news of another climate-driven disaster. But we still have the power to turn back the clock. Harnessing the power of collective human energy, today's university students are working together to chart a new future, demanding and creating the solutions for a sustainable climate. Our focus in science, engineering, activism, and politics offers the potential of a better tomorrow for all of us. Tune in to Campus Climate Corps for news of what is and what is not happening at this year's UN Climate Conference. Prepare for a livable tomorrow with a life and career of action. Join us and become part of the solution.